For those of you who've just joined us this afternoon, who've not been here before, we are doing a workshop on Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva, which is a kind of key text of Buddhism of the Great Vehicle. This morning we were looking at the first 3 chapters of this text, where Shantideva talks about the nature and the excellence of Bodhicitta, the mind of awakening or the mind of enlightenment, which means essentially the wish to gain enlightenment, Buddhahood, for the sake of others, for the sake of all beings. It's not just a question of finding happiness in the ordinary sense of the word, either in this life or the life to come. And it's not the same as wishing to be liberated from samsara, as Buddhists say, for oneself. It springs from a feeling of compassion towards the suffering of beings and an awareness that in our present state we can do little to help beings. And therefore the essence of Bodhicitta is precisely the wish and the decision to train on the path until one attains its complete and the highest goal, namely the omniscient state of Buddhahood, from which position one is able to work with beings, teach them, instruct them, to show them how to escape the essential problem of suffering. Kangyur Rinpoche says in his commentary on the Treasure of Precious Qualities that bodhicitta is the most precious thing in the universe, this attitude of mind. And Dingul Khyentse Rinpoche used to say that if you have bodhicitta, you have everything you need. And if you don't have bodhicitta, then no matter how much you haven't got enough. So this is the essential element of the path of the Great Vehicle, which includes not just the state of being free from samsara, but also the complete and full development of the mind itself, what we call omniscience, the state in which all objects of knowledge appear to the mind, which is one of the definitions of Buddhahood. Now, we'd finished the 3rd chapter this morning with the taking of the Bodhisattva vow, which is the complete, the kind of conclusion of what we call bodhicitta in aspiration, the wish to attain enlightenment for the sake of others. And we are now moving on to the second main section of this text, which is to show that once bodhicitta has been generated, once we have this idea, Shantideva has placed enormous emphasis on the fact that it is an inestimable treasure, and it is something that we must try not to lose. So this second section of the text are instructions on how to maintain bodhicitta and prevent it from degenerating. So this section is divided into 3 parts. There is a chapter on carefulness, a chapter on introspection, or vigilant introspection, and a chapter on patience, teachings on patience, how to deal with anger. So, the whole text itself is usually considered to be a kind of exposition of the 6 paramitas, the 6 transcendent virtues, which are the essential components of the Great Vehicle, the Mahayana. And these 6 perfections are generosity, discipline, patience, perseverance or diligence, concentration, and wisdom. These 6 elements of the Mahayana path. Now, and it is considered that in this first section of chapters 1 to 3, the first 2 parameters have been covered. The generosity and discipline are part and parcel of that 7-fold practice that we had seen this morning. So, and then we will, and this is carried on in the parameter of discipline of generosity is expressed in the chapters 2 and 3, and then the parameter of discipline is taken up in chapters 4 and 5. Then chapter 6 is patience, chapter 7 is heroic perseverance, chapter 8 is meditation or meditative concentration, and then wisdom comes in the 9th chapter. Okay, so we are trying to, since this is a workshop, we are trying to sort of get a good and clear idea of what Shantideva is doing in this text, so that when you leave, you will have a good idea of the way the text is constructed and what it means. So these 2 chapters, as I say, chapters 4 and 5, on carefulness and vigilant introspection, can be considered aspects of the parameter of discipline. So, discipline. It's a rather cold word, right? Bear in mind that etymologically it's coming from a Latin word meaning simply learning, training. It's what disciples do. Discipline and disciple, the 2 words are connected. And it corresponds also to the Greek word ascesis, ascetic, which also is another cold word. But again, you should bear in mind that ascesis in Greek just means, again, it means training, and it's what athletes do. In the classical Greek word, it's the athletes training on in the gymnasium. So again, we're taking up the whole challenge of training ourselves in this way of looking at things, this new way, this way of the Bodhisattva. And I would say that discipline is about dependability, about learning how to stay the course. And it's something that well, we could say that in this part of the text, remember that Shantideva is speaking to the monks of Nalanda, and what he's talking about is the vows and how to keep the vows. So he's talking about the monastic vows, but by extension, he's also talking about the vows of the lay people. So if all Buddhists have taken vows, the very fact of taking refuge involves commitments. And in order to maintain refuge, or in order to maintain the ordination of a lay person, you have to protect your vows, the vows that you take. And you have to know what they are, of course, and then protect them. Make sure you don't break them. Now the thing is that if your observance of the vows doesn't spring from a kind of joy, a kind of enthusiasm for the path, the vows themselves will become a burden. And so this is something to think about and to try and avoid. If you try to maintain your vows just as a duty or as a show, as a means of living up to the expectations of others, it'll eventually go sour and become a burden. And so the whole idea of discipline, the whole idea of training, is to sort of support your happy embracing of the, refuge or bodhicitta. And so the main thing, I think, is to try to get the point of the vows, or try to get the point of refuge, try to get the point of bodhicitta. It's not a question of being clever, it's not a question of trying to know, learn everything there is to know, but to get the point of it and let it sink in, let it sort of inform your whole way of thinking and behaving. So, as Khenpo Kunpel says in his commentary, he says that this implies that it is pointless just to pretend to be learned and to make eloquent disquisitions tricked out with all sorts of examples concerning bodhicitta and the ways of the bodhisattvas, ocean vast as they are. The important thing is to have a general knowledge of what the bodhisattva precepts are, and in particular to have a grasp of the crucial essence of these precepts, things to be avoided and things to be undertaken, and the list of downfalls. The crucial importance of aspiration and rejoicing in the... So if you probably don't know the precepts of the bodhisattvas or the downfalls of the bodhisattvas, and it would take up too much time actually to go through them. But if you take any reputable text like the Lamrim or the Treasure of Precious Qualities, you will find them all clearly described. So if you're serious about this path, then you need to familiarize yourself with them. So, as we begin this fourth chapter, what has happened is that Shantideva has, as it were, taken the vow of bodhicitta, bodhisattva vow. And the whole chapter finishes on a high note of enthusiasm, as we saw. So now he's kind of calming down, and he's beginning to see what it all implies. And so this is what is now he's going to take in stock what is implied by the vow, the commitment, and then to try to make sure that he can maintain it. So, the beginning of chapter 4, he says, the children of the conqueror, who thus have firmly grasped this bodhicitta, should never turn aside from it, strive never to transgress its disciplines. Whatever was begun without due heed, and all that was not properly conceived, although a promise and a pledge were given, it is right to reconsider. Should I act or not? So he's, the kind of enthusiasm at the end of the third chapter is now over, so now he's starting to see what it implies. And like in ordinary worldly commitments or plans, when you decide to act on a certain, take a certain path of action, take a decision to act in a certain way, it's usually wise to think whether you're capable of doing it. Right, and maybe to hang back and not go ahead. But Shantideva says that when we take the vow of the bodhicitta, when we become bodhisattvas in aspiration, we become the hope of beings. We talked about refuge, taking refuge, and to take the commitment, the bodhisattva commitment, is not merely to have taken refuge in an object of refuge, but to become an object of refuge ourselves, to become eventually a protector of beings. So he says, yet what the Buddhas and their heirs have scrutinized in their great wisdom, I myself have probed and scrutinized. Why should I now procrastinate? For if I bind myself with promises, but fail to carry out my words in deed, then every being will have been betrayed. what destiny must lie in store for me? So yes, the Bodhicitta is a wonderful thing. The Bodhisattva path is a marvelous path, but it means that one has committed oneself to the whole aggregate of beings, and therefore to sort of hang back from it and to refuse it out of laziness or out of a sense of defeatism is actually to leave beings unprotected, to turn one's back on them. And so even though it sounds almost preposterous to think in this way, in terms of ourselves, that's what the whole path is about. The whole of the teaching is to show us how to learn to become Buddhas. If we have a mind, Buddhahood is possible, because Buddhahood is merely the full flowering of the mind, the full flowering of the mind's potential. So we are already on the path because we have said that we want bodhicitta, and so the question is, how do we progress step by step, as it had been said in the vow. Now, if you look at the chapter of carefulness, here it might be helpful just to look at the textual outline. Remember, I said that this was an invention of Tibetan scholasticism, and it's a way of breaking down the subject matter of a text. So if you look on page 4, you will see it says part 2, how to prevent bodhicitta from weakening once it has been generated, and chapter 4, carefulness. As I said to you before, this textual outline is taken from Khenpo Kumpel's commentary on the Way of the Bodhisattva, and that he had followed the textual outline that had been devised by Patrul Rinpoche. So you will see, if you look at it, you will see that there are numbers at the right hand of every line, and these are actually page numbers in the Nectar of Manjushri's speech, so for the moment you can ignore them. What you need to home in on are the figures that are in the left-hand column, which look a bit mysterious, but I shall explain. It's not complicated. So page 4. Oh, sorry, is it not the... okay, maybe I've got a copy here. So yeah, but I have my photocopy, which is not the same page number. Yeah.
Handout page 13 is at the bottom of the page. Part 2, how to prevent bodhicitta from weakening.
Okay. Papers everywhere. Okay, so you find it on the bottom of page 13. So you will see the figures in the left-hand column: 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, and so on. And what these figures represent are textual levels. So if you look at chapter 4 in the textual outline, you will see that you have 1, a brief presentation, and 1, a detailed explanation. So on this level of 1, that is dividing the whole text into its primary division. So it is saying that this text is divided into 2 parts: a brief presentation and a detailed explanation. Right? Now, for the later figures, the rule of thumb is that the figure that you have on in the left-hand column is always a subdivision of the lower figure preceding it. Right? So if you look at number 1, a detailed explanation, you will see number 2, reflecting on the precepts to be implemented as a means to inculcate carefulness in one's behavior. And then if you jump down to another 2, you see reflection on the freedoms and advantages of the precious human body as a means to inculcate carefulness. And over the page, you'll find another 2, which is again reflecting on the afflictive emotions. So that means to say that underneath figure 1, a detailed explanation, those titles that are marked by 2 are the next subdivision. So this means that the detailed explanation is split in 3. It's split in reflecting on the precepts to be implemented, reflecting on the freedoms and advantages, and reflecting on the afflictive emotions, right? So then, underneath the first 2, you will see 2 3s, and these 3s are subdivisions of that 2. It makes it easier if you can see if the thing is indented. But when this text was published, the editor didn't want indentations, so we have to make do with these figures. Now, and the thing to remember that in a Tibetan text, the Tibetans didn't bother with tables of contents or indexes or anything like that. And what happens is that the sabche, this textual vision, is sort of embedded in the text itself. And so the writer will say, this text is divided into 2, 1 and 2, and tell you what they are. And then he will comment on number 1, if there are no subdivisions. And then when he gets to the second one, the detailed explanation, he will say, this detailed explanation is divided into 3, and give those 3 those 3 subheadings. And then he'll say first, and he'll jump back to that first 2, and he'll say this is divided into 2, and these are preventing the attitude of bodhicitta from weakening and observing the precepts. And then he'll comment each of those subheadings, and then he'll jump back to the next subdivision, which is the next point that is then going to be subdivided. So what the commentator does, you have to get used to it, but when you do, it's actually quite helpful. The commentator goes back and forward, back and forward, back and forward, and he goes through all of the different subdivisions, and that way he covers every sort of section of the text and comments on each of them in turn. So I can see that your eyes are glazing over, so I won't sort of insist on it. But anyway, the point is that when we get to the main section, the main part of this chapter on carefulness, he divides it into 3 sections, which is those 3 reflections. And the first of them is reflecting on the precepts as a means to gaining carefulness, this frame of mind, this sort of meticulous attitude towards one's behavior, and by explaining the consequences of what not doing it. And so after stanza 1, he goes on to a whole discussion of how to prevent bodhicitta, the bodhisattva attitude, from weakening. And this lasts from stanzas 2 to 12, as he says. So he said, okay, now that this vow has been taken, if I turn back from it, all beings are abandoned. I have abandoned all beings because in that vow, I have taken them on as my focus of interest. And he sort of says that a terrible destiny will await me if, having promised to protect beings, I let them down. You can read. There's no need for me to read it. You can read these stanzas yourselves. And then after that, after talking about preventing the attitude of the bodhicitta from weakening, he then talks about the precepts about relaxing diligence. No, I don't think that's right. Sorry, not relaxing, observing the precepts. So, So once he's sort of got those ideas in his mind, the necessity to prevent bodhicitta from weakening, and the necessity to observe the precepts without relaxing diligence, he then goes on to talk about, to remind himself of the precious opportunity that he has. He talks about 3 kinds of carefulness. He says that one should reflect on the freedoms and advantages of this present human life as a means of inculcating carefulness. That is to say, when we understand how precious our opportunity is, the fact that we've been born human, the fact that we've been born at a time when the Buddha Dharma exists, the fact that there are still people practicing it and are willing to teach it, and so on, the fact that we have an interest in it, all these are very precious. These sort of factors are coming together, and they sort of constitute a precious opportunity. And this opportunity is not going to last, so we must make the most of it. So he says, in stanza 15, the appearance of the Buddhas in the world, true faith, and the attainment of a human form, an aptitude for good, all these are rare. When will they come to me again? Today, indeed, I am hale and well. I have enough to eat, and I am not in danger. But this life is fleeting, unreliable. My body is like something briefly lent. And yet I act in such a way, the way I act is such that I shall not regain a human life. And losing this, my precious human form, my evils will be many, virtues none. So as I said yesterday, that once we have got this, once we have met the teachings, met a qualified teacher, once we have become interested in the Dharma and the Bodhisattva path, we have to keep walking on it. We have to keep pressing on. We can't just stop and rest. It's like, as I said, it's like somebody, if we don't keep training constantly and in the path, and we just sort of tread water, it's like somebody who's sort of sitting in a river and not swimming forward. If you just sit in a river, you'll be carried downstream automatically. So if you do nothing, if you just leave things as they are, it's certain that the Bodhisattva attitude will degenerate and you will eventually lose it. And not only that, you'll even lose any interest that you had in the Dharma to begin with. So, once this human life is attained, he says, he talks about the importance of striving in virtue. And therefore he's brought to the understanding, well, what is it that prevents me from having this continuous enthusiasm, this continuous interest in the Dharma, this continuous interest in the practice? And he says, it's because of my mental habits, my defilements. You know, I remember we were saying this morning that these mental habits are the things that actually are in the hard drive, not just in the RAM. They're not just, it's not a question of intellectual knowledge. It's a sort of change of attitude that comes about through meditation. And so he says that we should ask ourselves, we might feel that we're not in control, that we have these ideas, and yet they slip through our fingers. We have this sort of interest in the Dharma, and yet it sort of fades away, it tends to fade. And so we should ask ourselves again and again, what is it that makes us so stupid? What is it that prevents us from seeing the opportunity that we have? And so Shantideva says, well, they are the defilements that have harmed us from beginningless time. Ignorance and delusion, desire, craving, anger, aversion, and so on, which constantly weaken us. And so, now that we've come into the sphere of the Dharma, it's important to recognize them and to put an end to them. Once again, as I said this morning, it's a question of looking into oneself and honestly facing oneself, getting to know oneself, not deceiving oneself about who one is. He says it's as if by chance that I have gained this state so hard to find wherein to help myself. If now, while having such discernment, I am once again consigned to hell, I am as if benumbed by sorcery, as if reduced to total mindlessness. I do not know what dulls my wits, or what is it that has me in its grip. So we are all going to die, we are all going to find ourselves on our last bed. We know that the end is coming. So the question is, okay, I was a human being, I met the Dharma, what have I done with it? And if we find that we haven't done anything, then he says, my misery will be black indeed, if we've missed the chance. So he said, it's important to think like this so that won't happen. To sort of we protect ourselves by constantly sort of feeding our interest in the teaching. So, okay, so we have these negative emotions that constantly come up and cause chaos in our personal lives. So, what do? How do we get rid of them? And Shantideva says, why are they there in our mind? And the answer is because we let them live there. We welcome them. He says, anger, lust, these enemies of mine are limbless and devoid of faculties. They have no bravery, no cleverness. How then have they reduced me to such slavery? They dwell within my mind, and at their pleasure injure me. All this I suffer, meekly, unresenting. Thus my abject patience, all displaced. So we are impatient with the people who surround us, but we are very patient with our real enemies, namely negative emotions. If all the gods and demigods besides together came against me as my foes, they would be powerless to throw me down to fires of hell of unrelenting pain. So external enemies, all they can do, the worst they can do is kill the body. They can't kill the mind, and they can't throw you into the lower realms. But your real enemies, the negative emotions, can. And therefore you have to recognize them as enemies and destroy them. And Shantideva is very sort of strenuous, very sort of strong on this point. And he sort of adopts precisely this kind of militant language which goes with the idea of the Bodhisattva as a hero. O my enemy, afflictive passion, he says, endless and beginningless companion. No other enemy indeed is able to endure so long. All other foes that I appease and wait upon will eventually show me favors, give me every aid. But should I serve my dark, defiled emotions, they will only harm me, draw me down to grief. If thus my ancient and unceasing foes, the wellspring only of my growing pain, can lodge so safe within my heart, how can I live so blithe and fearless in the wheel of life? It's a very touching thought. It's a very it really makes one think that in fact all the seeds of our ruin, of our loss of the higher realms, of our loss of bodhicitta and refuge and so on, all the sort of qualities that we've managed to accumulate, we have the seeds of their ruin already in us. And therefore it's important to use discernment to identify them and, as I say, to destroy them. So Khenpo Kumbel says the basic reason for these ills, for these negative emotions, these enemies, which dwell in our hearts, is the fact that we don't fear samsara. We don't recognize the nature of samsara. We tend to think that the way we live, the world we live in, especially if we're living in somewhere like America and Boulder, is a rather pleasant place. And we try to do what we can to be happy in a rather superficial and material way, right? So we are good to our friends, we try to overcome our enemies, and so on and so forth. We protect our self-interests, and we we settle down and we have a nice time if we can. Of course, this is not open to everybody in the world, but for a lot of people in America, it is. A lot of people in Europe and America, it is. And so it's easy to forget that the nature of samsara is not like that at all. And so in the Buddhist texts, what they try to do by pointing out the defects of samsara is to bring you to a state of mind where you think that, as it says in the sutras, that the samsara is actually like a ditch of fire. It's like it being caught in a den of poisonous snakes. You mustn't feel that it's your friend, because it isn't. And so Shantideva says, okay, we have to, the discipline itself requires quite a bit of hardship, but it's hardship that is well spent. Because we have to be prepared to uproot many of the things that make us comfortable in this present way of life. Our attachment to possessions, our attachment to our bodies, our health, and so on and so forth. We have to sort of be prepared to call them into question and to see that there are some values that are greater than these. On the other hand, he does give us grounds for hope, because he says even though uncontrollable anger may break out, hatred, jealousy, pride, and so on, that can draw us completely away from the path and throw us into the lower realms, he nevertheless says that if you look, what you have to do is look at their nature. They're not like ordinary enemies that you have to sort of attack with guns or tanks or whatever. They are just thoughts. They're tenacious thoughts, but they are just thoughts. And so he says, strive to know their nature. Once you have done that, these negative emotions will start to disintegrate, will start to fade out, fade away. And therefore we must use wisdom. And this is an important point, because when we're dealing with our personal defects, our jealousy, our anger and so on, our desire, it's not a question of suppressing them. If you push them down, in the attempt, say, to be a respectable person, which is, I suppose, what we do, sort of fit into civilized society, we kind of suppress these negative emotions, but that's not enough, because things that are suppressed will actually break out sooner or later. Again, that's not the solution. What you have to do is to uproot the negative emotions, these defilements, to take them out by the root. And to do that, you need wisdom. You need the teachings on wisdom. And so he gives us a little foretaste that I mentioned last night, that if you have, obviously when you're in a crisis, you're not in a position to do much about it, of anger or desire and so on. But the whole point is to train in meditation, which is a sort of prerequisite, where you gradually, through practicing shine, shamatha meditation, you acquire a certain spaciousness in your mind and the possibility to see mental events as they arise before they completely take over. And at that point, you can sort of stand back from them and decide whether you're going to go ahead or not. So if you think about your own lives, our own lives, and we think how uncontrolled emotions have ruined so many situations. You might be in a perfectly good friendship, and then you suddenly say something cruel and vicious, and that's it. The friendship's over. You might be in a perfectly happy marriage, and you're more or less content, but then you see somebody else that you want, And in a moment of desire, you can wreck your life. Your marriage is over, your children are, their lives are also damaged. You know, the sort of lustful impulse can bring a lot of sorrow. So it makes sense to sort of train in this kind of awareness, this kind of carefulness, so that you can avoid these kind of unskillful situations. Shantideva says, okay, these are just thoughts. The defilement is not in the object. If you have lust for somebody, the lust is not in the object. It's not in the person. He or she may not even be aware of your desire, right? Again, your defilement is not in the faculties, not in your eyes or your ears, the sense faculties whereby you detect the presence of this person. So it's not in the object, it's not in the subject, this defilement. And if it's not anywhere else, and if it's not in the object, not only the subject, where can it be? Where is it? What is it? So when you sort of identify a defilement, what you have to do is to sort of look straight at it, search for it, try to recognize its nature. Where is it? It's not in my body. Where is it? It's not even in my mind. It's not in the object. It's a kind of mirage. It's not, even though it can inflict so much havoc and so much damage, in itself, it's nothing. It's not a powerful enemy after all. And if you sort of get the techniques of sort of diffusing these defilements, then they will eventually leave you alone. So Shantideva says, defilements are not in the object, nor within the faculties, nor somewhere in between. And if not elsewhere, where is their abode, whence they inflict their havoc on the world? They are simple mirages, and so take heart. Banish all your fear, and strive to know their nature. Why suffer needlessly the pains of hell? This is how I should reflect and labor, that I might apply the precepts thus set forth. What invalids in need of medicine ignored their doctor's words and gained their health? So he says, here are the instructions. If you don't implement them, of course you will fall. But here they are. All you have to do is put them into practice. So this leads us into the 5th chapter, which is Vigilant Introspection. And as I said last night, this is what in Tibetan is known as sheshin, which is a kind of faculty of the mind, which enables you to sort of look inside your mind to see what's going on. It's actually an interesting feature of the mind, and one of the signs that it isn't really a sort of concrete thing is that you can make endless divisions in your sort of mental states. You know, you can be in a state of anger or pride or whatever, but it is still possible to stand back and see the pride. You could even stand back from that which is seeing the pride, and an endless regression of witnesses, so to speak. So now we come to this practice of vigilant introspection, which is another word for mindfulness, which is widely taught in America, in American Buddhism and elsewhere. If you are going to practice mindfulness, obviously you have to know what to be mindful of. So the teachings on mindfulness are predicated on the knowledge of what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected. All right? And here, as elsewhere, we are our own teachers, in the sense that once you know about what to do and what not to do, the place of work is in your own heart, your own mind. And so on that level, one of the things that we have to do is to try to avoid deceiving ourselves, to sort of try to cultivate an attitude of real honesty about what I'm feeling. You know, like if you're in a state of lust, for instance, look at it and don't try to say, "Oh, this is a terrible thing. I'm not a lustful person," and sort of pretend that you're a good person when in fact you have this defilement. It's not a question of being a good person or a bad person. The thing that you have to do is to look squarely at the state of mind so that you can recognize it. So, as Khenpo Kumpel says, you know, in this kind of practice, the important thing is to be our own witness and not to rely on the gossip or the remarks of others necessarily, except, of course, one's teacher, who is there to guide us. He says, people who give us advice, in inverted commas, succeed only in irritating us and not placing us on the path. By contrast, if we ourselves have brought our thoughts, words, and deeds onto the path, we will not be irritated when we make mistakes, and we will return to the path again. We should be teachers to ourselves. So here, I'm sure, you know, the teachings on mind training will say that you have to sort of be gentle with yourself, but you have to be firm. You mustn't pretend. When you fall, the Bodhisattva, the practitioner of the path, simply has to get up and carry on. How many times you make the mistake, you acknowledge the mistake, and you carry on. You mustn't sort of say, "I'm useless," and give up. Because Shantideva says, if you give up, then you're letting everybody, all the beings, down. So, this real discipline comes from keeping a watch over our inner minds. And if we are careless and lax about the way we think, about the things we fantasize about our daydreams, about the parts of the internet we surf to, and things like this, then our behavior just becomes a kind of external structure. And what happens then is that there becomes a kind of separation between a facade that we present to the world and our real self. All right? We put up a show, but it's not really us. And when that happens, we fail to do precisely what Shantideva is doing, namely to train ourselves. You know, I think it's one of the great dangers of the internet, that it actually removes one of the factors which in ordinary society keeps us more or less on the straight and narrow. You know, you do worry about what people think about you, but when you're on the internet, nobody's watching. At least, well, we think there's nobody watching. So, you know, it gets terribly easy to, you know, download a film without paying for it. You know, it's quite an easy thing to do. And all sorts of other things that you can get involved in, which, you know, you can get involved in all sorts of computer games, and you know, which can be extremely violent. And this is one of the great dangers for children nowadays, is that they can get into situations where they have no guidelines about what is correct behavior or not. And of course, even though, you know, in a computer game you may kill your enemies, and you're not actually killing a human being, so you're not guilty of murder. Nevertheless, the attitude, the sort of habit of killing becomes, you get used to it, becomes a sort of, and even a second nature. And so you have nowadays, more than ever before, you have these stories of children who who shoot their parents or shoot their children other children in the school, because they've got this kind of feeling that once you shoot somebody, they'll get up again and you can carry on with the game. It's a very dangerous thing to happen. On the other hand, so yes, there is this facade, and whereas the reality, and the reality behind the facade can be fairly sleazy. So, on the other hand, it is a characteristic of a truly spiritual person, I would say, that there isn't a facade. What you see is the real person. So when you're in the presence of a teacher, for instance, an authentic teacher, you realize that he really is like the way he appears. Because the way he appears is simply an expression of the way he has trained himself. And so this is actually something we should always try, I think, to cultivate in ourselves, that we are completely genuine, that we express what we feel. We don't sort of hide our failings, but we try to cultivate this sort of virtuous attitude towards beings so that it becomes a kind of our real nature, our real character. So, again, the parameter of generosity, the parameter of discipline, and later on the parameter of patience. But we need to understand what a parameter is. Generosity, discipline, patience, and so on, they are virtues that everybody knows about. What makes them into a parameter, a transcendent virtue, is the unification of these virtues with wisdom. The wisdom of emptiness, actually. And so, although we'll go into this in greater detail later, what it means is that you cultivate what they call, in the teachings, the emptiness of the three spheres. That is to say, you tell yourself, remind yourself, that when something is being performed, when some virtue is being performed, the subject of that action is not a really existent thing. The action itself is not a really existent thing, and the object to which you do that action is not a really existent thing. Of course, right at the beginning, this doesn't make much sense. But what it's getting at is that you have to try not to take too seriously your own virtues. When you practice patience, when you practice generosity, you might be tempted to feel, I'm a generous person, I'm a rather good person, right? And what I'm doing is a good deed. But what this emptiness of the three spheres does is to inject certain spaciousness into that whole situation where you no longer feel self-important, where you no longer feel that the thing that you've done is a really good thing, and you no longer feel that the object is a genuinely existing object. So what it means is that you recognize that the virtues become a sort of play, if you like, and it's not. It's a way of not taking yourself too seriously, and that also helps in the times when you fail to live up to what you wanted to do. It's not a big deal. What is a big deal is that you get up and carry on. That's the point. So Shantideva says we have to take in hand our own minds. We have to look at our own minds. Try to recognize our failings and also our virtues. So he says, transcendent giving is to dissipate the poverty of beings. So And then the commentator goes into a whole kind of disquisition about the generosity of the Buddhas. All right? So, if transcendent giving is to dissipate the poverty of beings or to teach beings, we can see that many Buddhas in the past have arisen in the past and disappeared, and yet here we are. They didn't help us. So that shows that the perfection of giving or the perfection of charity is not a question of the actual act itself, but the decision or the wish to do that act. The paramitas are a question of the mind's orientation. So he says, if transcendent giving is to dissipate the poverty of beings, in what way, since the poor are always with us, have former Buddhas practiced it? Transcendent giving, so the teachings say, consists in the intention to bestow on every being all one owns, together with the fruits of such a gift. It is indeed a matter of the mind itself. Where could beings, fishes and the rest, be placed to keep them safe from being killed? Deciding to refrain from every harmful act is said to be transcendent discipline. So if you want to practice discipline, that means the discipline of not harming others, for instance. It's obvious that you can't protect everybody in real terms. But what the paramita of discipline is to cultivate this attitude of wishing to do so. And of course, if you do that, then in any given situation, you never will do so, right? But it's not a question, you don't have to worry about whether I'm saving the world or whether I'm relieving the whole human race of poverty. The main thing is to cultivate this attitude of wishing to do so. And therefore he says that in the case of enemies, the world is full of enemies. I can't possibly conquer them all. He says, harmful beings are everywhere like space itself. Impossible it is that all should be suppressed. But let this angry mind alone be overthrown, and it's as though all foes had been subdued. To cover all the earth with sheets of leather, where could such amounts of skin be found? But with the leather soles of just my shoes, it is as though I cover all the earth. So the idea is, if you want to walk comfortably over the earth, the stones, the gravel and so on, there are two possibilities. Either you cover everything with carpets or with leather, which would be difficult to do. Or you can just cut a little piece of leather and put it on the sole of your foot, right? So external enemies are very numerous. You can't deal with them all. They'll always be coming at you. But if you manage to diffuse this attitude of anger, you won't actually have any enemies, right? The enemies that you cognize as something hostile will no longer be there because you have so trained your mind that you no longer feel this hostility. Now, just to go back to this idea of, recognizing one's thoughts and recognizing, as it were, the nature of one's mind, and learning by that means to cope with defilement, negative emotions, which in turn condition completely the way we perceive and experience the world and the way we react to it and create situations. This chapter is actually placing us directly in front of what our mind is. So as I said last night, Dingwa Khyentse Rinpoche used to say that this text is a pointing out instruction to the nature of the mind, and which is very important in the higher teachings of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, where the Lama actually shows to the disciple who's ready and transmits the understanding of the nature of the mind. This is actually what Shantideva is doing. He's actually explaining in a way, demonstrating the nature of the mind. And so Khenpo Kumpel says, as for wisdom, the most important thing for everyone to understand is the nature of the mind, which is empty, devoid of self, and luminous. Everyone who has a mind is able to do this. Although everyone possesses it, this nature, not everybody knows or realizes it. That is why the nature of the mind is described as a secret. All external phenomena arise in the mind like reflections in a mirror. They are mental fabrications. They are the mere display of the mind and do not extend beyond it. So what he means here is that we feel that we are living in a world that is separate from us, that's outside the mind. And to some extent, this is true. Everybody sitting in this room perceives the room, right? It's a common experience. So you would say that this room is kind of existing independently of us, right? When we go out of the room and come back tomorrow, the room will be here, right? So we think that there is a sort of really existing material universe outside us. Now, whether or not that's true, one thing that we can immediately recognize is that if there is such a thing as an objective room, there's no such thing as an objective experience of the room. If we are experiencing the room, it's subjective. So what we perceive is something happening in our own minds, right? And that's why, although we all more or less experience a room like this room, in fact, no two people experience it in the same way. Like a person who is a botanist, for instance, or somebody who enjoys flowers will probably notice these flowers, right? Somebody who doesn't care about flowers may sit through the whole session and not even notice that the flowers are there, right? Again, according to our physical position, we see a different picture in our minds of this room. I can see this part of it, and you can see the part behind me. So nobody actually has an exactly identical perception of this external world. And so that's why we say that, as he said, that this external world is a mere display of the mind and does not extend beyond it in each individual case. This is what in Tibetan is known as Rangnang, that the universe that appears to each one of us, which is slightly different for each of us, but is globally the same. And so you might ask, well, how come? How does this happen? And according to the Buddhist teachings, the way that you perceive something really depends on your karma, on the kind of body that your karma has produced. So at the present moment, we have a human body. We all have human bodies. And therefore what we perceive is a sort of human world. And that depends on the organization of our sense faculties, right? So we are sitting here in what looks like a room, but if a mosquito were to fly through the room that has completely different sense organs, doesn't have eyes the way we have eyes, nose, ears, etc., it's very unlikely that the mosquito perceives a room like this. The mosquito is probably looking for blood. And so what the mosquito is aware of is various areas of blood, right? We don't think of the room as various areas of blood, right? But a mosquito might. But the mosquito's mind is just as much a mind as our mind, so who's right? What the mosquito perceives, what we perceive, are completely different, but that depends on the way our sense faculties are organized. So we are human beings, and to the extent that our karma is similar, we will perceive a similar world. So as I say, with perhaps significant variations depending on each individual. And so they say also in the teachings that there is this concept of karma, which is in Tibetan is called le, and there is also a concept called letro, which means unfinished karma. And when we say this, it means that each of us sitting in this room are sharing an unfinished karma. That all the different, the fact that we can sit here in human bodies, in this particular place, at this particular time, is the result of an incredibly complicated, complex system of interdependent situations, conditions. And our mind streams, or whatever, over the many, many lives in the past, have gradually sort of accumulated the necessary conditions for us to be here and perceive more or less, to perceive each other and perceive more or less the same place. When that karma is finished, we will no longer perceive each other. Right? So if somebody is letro, that is causing this particular situation, finishes in the next second, that person will die. That will be the end of their connection with us at this particular point in time, right? So everything is sort of appearing according to this incredibly complicated network of causes and conditions. So he goes on to say, all these appearances are mental fabrications. They are the mere display of the mind and do not extend beyond it. The principal task, therefore, is to understand the mind clearly, and to that end we must use reasoning. We must examine the mind, our own mind. We must look for its shape, its color, and so on. We must search for the place where the mind arises, where it dwells, where it ceases. When he says mind here, it means the state of awareness that we're in, right? So, when did it start? Where is it? Can I find it anywhere? Where is it going to go to when it finishes? If we fail to understand that the mind is beyond every concept of origin, dwelling, and cessation, if we fail to penetrate this secret of the mind, its emptiness and lack of self, then no matter how much we long to achieve the joy of nirvana and to uproot the sorrows of samsara, we will wander uselessly in misery. So here he's coming back to what Shantideva was saying, that our behavior, our experience is completely conditioned by the kind of mental contents that we have, whether they are negative or positive, whether they are defilements or virtues. And so in the case of the defilements which we want to remove, it's important to recognize their nature. This is what Shantideva has just said, as we said, and this is what Kampu Kumpal has repeated. So then Shantideva goes on to say that if I'm going to sort of keep control of what's happening, if I'm going to be in a position to recognize these defilements, if I'm going to be able to do something about them and dissipate them, and so on, it stands to reason that I must try to be constantly aware of what's going on, right? Therefore, from the gateway of my mind, my mindfulness will not have leave to stray, and if it wanders, it shall be recalled by thoughts of anguish in the lower worlds. So I sometimes reflect to myself that, if you want to know what samsara is, all you have to do is to try to meditate for a couple of moments, right? What will happen is, you start sort of watching your breath. You settle down, you try to get quiet. And before long, you will find that you're thinking about something. A chain of thought will have set up. One thought will lead to another. You think about your car, you think about the fact that it has no gas, you think you have to go to the supermarket, and how wonderful supermarkets are. It's, and it's so convenient, and it's thanks to our wonderful government and, democracy and all that, history of America. You go through a whole kind of storyline. But the thing is that when you realize that you're in that, the thought is already well established, I think, for most of us. What we never notice is the beginning, right? We try to be present, we try to sort of concentrate, and then we notice that we're not concentrating. What we don't notice is where it started. That means that although we think we're awake, and although we think we are aware, there's a gap, there's a hole, right? And that's quite interesting, because it means that what we take for consciousness is actually largely a matter of unconsciousness, right? It's like a kind of Gruyere cheese, it's full of holes. So, and then you say, well, what's happening in those moments of blankness, those moments of unconsciousness? And how come I start to think about something and not something else? And the only answer that you can give to this is habit, a sort of tendency that you gradually forms through your actions. And that's actually what samsara is. Samsara is wandering from one state to another without control, based on semi-conscious habits, in a way that is characterized by ignorance and eventually will be characterized by dissatisfaction and suffering. So it's mental wandering is the essential nature of samsara. So by trying to rein in this mental wandering, you're actually working with your samsaric condition. One of the ways. And therefore he says, I'll put my mindfulness like a guard at the door of my mind, and whenever it strays, I'll pull it back in fear of the consequences of mental wandering, because normally our tendencies are usually negative, and therefore they will lead to negative mental states, and therefore suffering, and so on. So he says that I will stop it from wandering through fear of the lower realms, through fear of suffering. And then he says, through fear, and by the counsels of their abbots, and staying ever in their teachers' company, in those endowed with fortune and devotion, mindfulness is cultivated easily. The Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas both possess unclouded vision, seeing everything. All lies open to their gaze, and likewise I am always in their presence. One who has such thoughts as these will gain devotion and a sense of fear and shame. For such a one, the memory of Buddha rises frequently before the mind. When mindfulness is stationed as a sentinel, a guard upon the threshold of the mind, introspection will be likewise there, returning when forgotten or dispersed. So one tries, not only in meditation situation, but also in everyday life, one tries to sort of keep coming back to the present moment, watching what is going on, being aware of what's happening. And at this section of the text, Shantideva he introduces what I call the log teachings. I mentioned them, where he says, if at the outset, when I check my mind, I find that it is tainted with some fault, I shall be still and self-possessed, unmoving like a piece of wood. In other words, you don't immediately rush in to react against what's happening in your mind. If you're feeling downcast, or if you're feeling afraid, or if you're feeling people don't like you, or if you're feeling attached to something, if you're afraid of losing it, when that happens, when you become aware of what's there, if it is negative, don't do anything for the moment, just look. Just remain calm. I shall be still and self-possessed. And then he gives a whole series of verses when he talks about how he's going to move around. So he even he says that, when you're sitting in a chair, or when you're standing, or when you want to move across the room, you should ask yourself what's happening. You should be aware. And I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of practice. The walking meditation that the Theravadins practice is that you practice being aware of how your foot touches the ground and how you lift it, and the sensations that occur to the body. And so he says, "My body shall remain like this." In other words, when you do something, when you decide to do something, you kind of decide how you're going to be. And embarking upon a given course, from time to time I'll verify, inquiring how my body is disposed. This rampant elephant, my mind, once tied to that great post, reflection on the teachings, must now be watched with all my strength, that it might never slip away. Those who strive to master concentration should never for an instant be distracted. They should always watch their minds, inquiring, where is now my mind engaged? Of course, he says, it's important to come off it from time to time. You can't keep carrying on like this. There are times when you need to relax, and that's okay. But regularly, one should try to cultivate this sense of being, in a state of self-possession. And he says, when something has been planned and started on, attention should not drift to other things. With thoughts fixed on the chosen target, that and that alone should be pursued. Behaving in this way, all tasks are well performed, and nothing is achieved from doing otherwise. If thus we act, the secondary defilement, a lack of introspection, will not grow. So, it's a good advice. It's not very easy to do. You're constantly engrossed in doing 101 things at once. And once energy gets dissipated. But here what he's telling us, that if you want to progress in mindfulness, you should make an effort to try and simplify, to try and be present. And so he says that when you notice situations of negativity arising, then the thing to do, if you're not in a position, especially if you're not in a position to directly recognize the nature of that thought so that it immediately dissipates as soon as it arises, people who are well practiced in meditation are able to do that. But if we're not able to do that, which is certainly my case, probably for most of us, what you have to do is to sort of close down the system, perform a kind of lockdown, so that when you're in a state of negativity, you don't let it spill out into activity. Because once you perform an action, you have accumulated a karma, and that karma will fructify eventually. So, and if you're interested in staying on the Bodhisattva path, that's what you have to avoid. So he says, when the urge arises in your mind to feelings of desire or angry hate, do not act, be silent, do not speak, and like a log of wood, be sure to stay. And when your mind is wild or filled with mockery, or filled with pride and haughty arrogance, or when you want to expose another person's secret guilt, or bring up old dissensions, or to act deceitfully, or when you want to fish for praise, or criticize and spoil another's name, or use harsh language, sparring for a fight, it's then that like a log you should remain. Bear in mind that Shantideva was talking to himself. Shantideva was a monk. Shantideva was living in a monastic community of men. And if you've ever tried to do that, if you're living in retreat or living with a closed group of people working in an office, you will find these kind of things constantly coming up, people who irritate you, people that you like, things that you don't want to do, feelings that, making fun of others, feeling superior to them. So he's saying that when this kind of thing comes up, this is the moment when you should stay like a log and not externalize what you're thinking. When you yearn for wealth, attention, fame, a circle of retainers serving you, And when you look for honors, recognition, it's then that like a log you should remain. And when you are inclined to overlook another's need and want to get the best thing for yourself, when you feel the urge to speak, it's then that like a log you should remain. So Khenpo Kumpel says, it's like people who, trample on everybody else to get a good seat in the temple. When you feel that impulse to sort of be near the Lama and push everybody behind you, that's when you should try to be like a log. And when you want people serving you, when you want people to look after you, Khenpo Kumpel says rather amusingly, when you want people to prepare your bed and tuck you in at night, it's then that you should avoid these sort of these kind of dependencies. And in fact, in the commentarial tradition, there's a whole list of 27 sources of mistaken conduct, which are actually being listed in these stanzas, even though, put in their poetic form, you don't notice them. If you're interested to find out what they are, you'll find them in Khenpo Kumpel's commentary. Impatience, indolence, faint-heartedness, and likewise arrogance and careless speech, attachment to your side, when these arise, it's then that like a log you should remain. Examine thus yourself from every side, take note of your defilements and your pointless efforts, for thus the heroes on the Bodhisattva path seize firmly on such faults with proper remedies. With perfect and unyielding faith, with steadfastness, respect and courtesy, with conscientiousness and awe, work calmly for the happiness of others. So, of course, it's not easy. One is surrounded by all sorts of temptations. One interacts with people who are not interested in the Dharma, who don't know anything about the compassion or the practice of bodhicitta and so on. And he says, don't be upset by childish people. Don't be upset by their endless quarrels. As he said, work calmly for the benefit of others. When acting irreproachably for our sake or the sake of others, let us always bear in mind the thought that we are selfless, like an apparition. So here is introducing this idea that I mentioned before, the emptiness of the three spheres. That, when you're in a real life situation, at your job or in the family and so on, these situations come up and you recognize them and you try to either apply the antidotes, or if you can't, then at least you don't react. You try to lighten up and remember that it is a kind of mirage, and so you don't get too engrossed in the situation, you don't get too upset by what's happening, you don't take yourself too seriously. And then he says, this supreme freedom of a human life, so long awaited, now at last attained, reflecting always thus, maintain your mind, and as steady as Sumeru, king of mountains, Sumeru being the central mountain according to the Indian view of the universe. And then he goes on to talk about our own relationship to our own bodies. When you get this idea clear in your mind that you can remain in a state of self-possession and sort of take control of your mind, then you're in a position to sort of look around and to see how you relate to other parts of your being, right? And so here, for the first time, he introduces the idea of the separation between mind and body. On the one hand, there is our mind, and on the other, there is the body, right? And as I said yesterday, we are conditioned to think of the human person as being a single entity, right? Certainly in the Judeo-Christian way of thinking, the body and the soul form an intrinsic entity, and the death is something unnatural, and the separation of the body and soul is a kind of violation of our true nature, which is a consequence of the fall. But at the end of time, there is the resurrection of the body, and our body and soul will be rejoined again. This is completely foreign to the Buddhist way of looking at things. And also, the Buddhist idea of looking at things is quite different from the materialistic point of view, which thinks that matter is the only thing that exists, and that the mind is just a sort of epiphenomenon of the brain. I would say that the Buddhist theory of mind and body and mind is not really a sort of strictly reasoned out philosophical position. What I think it is, at least at this point, is it's reflecting what our experience is. We have a body, but it's not ourself. We talk about my body, right? That means who is saying my, right? Well, you can say, well, of course, it's the mind who's speaking, and the mind on one side and the body on the other. But of course, you can take it a step further, and you can talk about my mind, and in which case, who's talking about my mind, right? But anyway, that's another matter. But the point that is being made here is that there is a distinction between mind and body. And what Shantideva then goes on to do in this chapter is to question the way in which we are kind of engrossed in our own bodies. And, we expend an enormous amount of time protecting our bodies, our health and so on, which is important. We get very upset when people criticize our bodies and make references to our appearance. We get very upset about it. We immediately spring to the defense of our bodies. The mind does this, and so on. When the body is hungry, we feed it. When it's ill, we try to cure it, and so on. So, the identification of the mind with the body, Shantideva says, is actually he will say that as I said before, when you're talking about the perception of a world, the body is kind of external to the mind, even though it's very intimate, and so we can look at it and sort of analyze it. And he would say that it's a little bit like what happens in the ephemeral hells. I don't know if you know about this. The doctrine, Buddhist teachings about the hells is quite complicated. And one of the kinds of hell is a state in which beings identify with a physical object, like a door, or a log of wood, or a stove. And they suffer when, the stove is heated, or the door is slammed. And it's not that the door is that person, but the mind has somehow got engrossed in it, and it identifies it as its own body. And this is apparently a possibility in the evolution of the possible ways in which the mind can evolve. So he says, well, this body of mine, it causes me so much trouble. This physical aggregate is like a magnet for suffering. It grows old, it gets weak, it gets sick. I get so unhappy about it. And so he says, well, it doesn't make sense to exaggerate my concern for it. He says at least one thing's good about it. It can feed the vultures at the end. So that's one reason for my keeping it, right? But of course, he's only saying this as a kind of technique to sort of diffuse our exaggerated preoccupation with the body. Of course, elsewhere he will say that this body is a priceless vehicle. It's because we have this body that we're able to find the teachings, we are able to communicate with others and so on. And so he says this body is like he says, make this body serve you. He says, if servants who cannot be set to work are not rewarded with supplies and clothing, why do you sustain with such great pains this body which, though nourished, will abandon you? You will lose it eventually. So why, So he says, pay this body due remuneration, but then be sure to make it work for you. And do not lavish everything on what will not bring perfect benefit. So the problem with the materialistic attitude of thinking that there is nothing beyond this life, that the body is the only reality, is that it's actually fundamentally deluded, because the body will vanish, the body will abandon us. He says, regard your body as a vessel, a simple a boat for going here and there. Make of it a thing that answers every wish to bring about the benefit of beings. So he says, so use your physical life, use this life properly. Don't waste time putting your energies where it doesn't pay. Exaggerated, preoccupation with the body. On the contrary, the body should be kept healthy, because a healthy body is not only will it last long, but it is a good basis for concentration. You know very well that when you've got a headache, or when you're sick, it's difficult to concentrate. So you should do what you can to maintain a healthy constitution. But that doesn't mean to say being completely engrossed in your physical condition. Okay, so I invite you to read more in this chapter. It's basically, he goes on to give various examples and various arguments to expatiate about what I've just been saying, how the best way to live in your body, how the best way to gain a kind of control of your mind and so on, so that it can, your bodily constitution can serve the Dharma and therefore the benefit of others. And then he finishes by saying, examining again and yet again the state and actions of your body and your mind, this alone defines in brief the maintenance of watchful introspection. But all this must be carried out in truth, for what is to be gained by mouthing syllables? What invalid was ever helped by merely reading in the doctor's treatises? So if you take this chapter of Shantideva on the importance of vigilant introspection, it's important to put it into practice. There's no use just reading it as a sort of entertainment or something that's merely interesting. The whole kind of path, the success of the path, depends on being able to control the mind, to be in possession of the mind, and not let it draw you down to states of suffering. Now, in the 6th chapter, a chapter on patience, Shantideva talks about the problem of anger and how to deal with anger. He says that anger is in fact our worst enemy, because anger is what destroys this positive energy which is called which we call merit. He says, all good works gathered in 1,000 ages, such as deeds of generosity and offerings to the blissful ones, a single flash of anger shatters them. No evil is there similar to anger, no austerity to be compared with patience. Steep yourself, therefore, in patience, in various ways, insistently. By anger, as I said last night, Shantideva means the kind of hatred that wishes to destroy. It's not just being annoyed. Being annoyed and being irritated can lead into anger, but the really dangerous defilement is this kind of uncontrollable rage which seeks to destroy its object. You will know that a moment of uncontrollable rage, where you lash out at somebody, where you say something cruel, can completely destroy an entire relationship. Even more so when it comes, from the Dharma point of view, it destroys all the kind of meritorious energy that you've managed to accumulate. And as you know, if you've received teachings on dedication, one of the values of dedication, when you dedicate the merit, is it's one way of protecting your merit from the ravages of anger. So there are two things we should always do in regard to merit. We should always try to dedicate it and protect it in that way. And on the other hand, we should do what we can to avoid anger from arising. And this is the practice of patience, the practice of zerpa in Tibetan. Zerpa in Tibetan means the ability to carry something, to bear it. That's what patience is in Buddhism. Being able to bear with difficult situations. So he says this chapter is divided into three main sections. There is a section on the removal of anger, how anger can be removed or should be removed. Then there is a very long section on the cultivation of patience, and then finally there is a section on the way that we should respect beings. So he says, those tormented by the pain of anger never know tranquility of mind. Strangers they will be to every pleasure. They will neither sleep nor feel secure. Even those dependent on their Lord for gracious gifts of honor and of wealth will rise against and slay a master who is filled with anger and of hate. A person who is angry, a person who has a mind that is uncontrolled, is a source of suffering to himself and a source of suffering to others. A person who hasn't controlled his anger will create misery around him or her. In a family, for instance, a person who cannot control their anger, intolerance, impatience, and so on, just makes everybody else in the family miserable. So that's something we should bear in mind. If we have a problem with anger, we are creating problems for ourselves, and we are making everyone around us unhappy. Whether it's in your family, in the office, or wherever. So he says, his family and friends he grieves, and is not served by those his gifts attract. He's talking about this Lord who sort of attracts, kind of mafia boss, who attracts, dependents by giving them protection or giving them gifts. But if this mafia boss is a really uncontrolled, angry person, even the people that he's attracted will end up killing him. Right? You can well imagine a sort of that kind of situation. And so he concludes, no one is there, all in all, who, being angry, lives at ease. All these ills are brought about by wrath, our sorrow-bearing enemy. But those who seize and crush their anger down will find their joy in this and future lives. And so he says, well, what is it that causes anger? And he says, basically, it's discontent. It's being unhappy. When you are unhappy and you meet with situations you don't want, anger will come up. So it's quite important to know how to be happy, how to create situations of happiness. Getting what I do not want, and all that hinders my desire, in discontent my anger finds its fuel. From this it grows and beats me down. Therefore, I will utterly destroy the sustenance of this my enemy, my foe who has no other purpose but to hurt and injure me. So come what may, I'll not upset my cheerful happiness of mind. Dejection never brings me what I want. My virtue will be warped and marred by it. If there's a remedy when trouble strikes, what reason is there for dejection? And if there is no help for it, what use is there in being glum? So he says, you have to learn to live skillfully so that you can cope with disappointments without losing a sort of basic cheerfulness, which is an essential attitude of the Bodhisattva path. And so he says, basically, when you're cultivating patience, you cultivate patience with regard to two things. You cultivate patience with regard to what you don't want, and you cultivate patience with regard to what prevents you from getting what you want, right? When an unpleasant situation arises, you have to learn patience with regard to this. And if you really want something to happen and then something prevents it, you have to cultivate patience with regard to that obstacle, right? So when it comes to cultivating patience with regard to what you do not want, this again is divided into four basic ideas. First of all, there is cultivation of patience towards what brings us suffering. There's cultivation of patience towards people who treat us with scorn and disrespect. There is cultivating patience towards those who ill-treat our loved ones. And there is cultivating patience towards those who help our enemies. Again, patience, once again, we're caught in the problems of translation. Patience means knowing how to deal with something, knowing how to put up with it, knowing how to turn it to some good result. So when it comes to the first of those four, knowing how to cultivate patience towards what brings us suffering. So then Shantideva sort of thinks about what suffering is, our own suffering. And again, he splits it up into another set of 3 points, and he says, there is the patience of accepting suffering when it happens, and there is the patience of certainty regarding the ultimate reality of things. That's to say, an ability to put up with suffering when you kind of understand a little bit more about the reality of phenomena, how the nature of phenomena. And then there is the patience of making light of what harms us, not taking it too seriously. That's also a kind of patience. So, going back to the first thing, he says, kind of patience in accepting suffering. And he says that suffering is not something we can ever escape. And yet, there's a certain good side to suffering. There's a certain good side to being uncomfortable. He says that the cause of happiness is rare, and many are the seeds of suffering. So in this samsaric situation, suffering on the whole is what happens mostly. What we normally consider happiness is usually, if you look at it carefully, it's like a kind of period of, calm between the storms. And as it is said in Buddhism, that what normally people regard as happiness is actually a form of suffering for the simple reason that it doesn't last. The pleasant dinner party, or the happy friendship, or the loving relationship, the state of health and so on, they don't last, they eventually go. So that sort of introduces this idea that there's something fundamentally unsatisfactory even in what we think of as happiness, right? So he says that seeds of suffering are very many, and the causes of happiness are rare. But then he says, but if I have no pain, I'll never long for freedom. Therefore, O my mind, be steadfast. So if we were completely comfortable all the time, like the gods, we would never seek liberation from samsara. This is actually one of the advantages of the human state, is that we have sufficient happiness to have or peace, or good fortune, to have that kind of space to think about the Dharma. If you're in hell and you're being sliced up with a chainsaw, you're not going to have much mental space to think about the Dharma, right? So in this human life, there are moments when we do, we're not in a total suffering. So this gives us a kind of space in which to practice. On the other hand, there is suffering in human life, and that has its value, because if we didn't have it, we'd get too comfortable and we never seek to get out of samsara. And that's the predicament of the gods. They never practice because they don't feel the need to, and they don't feel the need to because they never have discomfort. So, and then Shantideva says, "So, O my mind, be steadfast. You learn how to cope with difficulties, to cope with illness, to cope with weakness, to cope with all sorts of calamities." And he said, "There's nothing that does not grow light through habit and familiarity. So putting up with little cares, I'll train myself to bear with great adversity." And so he says that when you have these little irritations that come, like maybe a mosquito stinging you, or maybe a stupid remark that you hear someone make about you, these little irritations, you don't sort of react against them, but you kind of use them. You get used to putting up with them, because when you do that, when you get used to bearing with pain, when something really big happens, you'll be in a position to cope with it much better. So this is actually, essential to the Buddhist training. The Buddhist training is just a matter of trying to develop useful habits, and so with little obstacles that come your way, you use them in order to train, in order to deal with the much bigger ones. So he uses this idea, it's actually an interesting remark that somebody made yesterday, that Shantideva has a very kind of aggressive attitude to his negativities, almost like a soldier. And it's true that he came from a royal family, so he came from the soldier caste. So maybe that's he's kind of genetically primed for this kind of way of looking at things. But it's true that throughout the way of the Bodhisattva, he often uses images of fighting and images of conquering. So he says there are some whose bravery increases at the sight of their own blood. So he's thinking of the kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger types who when they get in the heat of the battle, when they notice that they're wounded, it sort of increases their aggression and their bravery. While some, he says, lose all their strength and faint when it's another's blood they see. So some people get really sort of worked up, and their strength increases when they see they are themselves injured, whereas others completely faint when somebody else is injured. And this results, he said, on how the mind is set, in steadfastness or cowardice. And so I'll scorn all injury, and hardships I will disregard. When sorrows fall upon the wise, their minds should be serene and undisturbed. For in their war against defiled emotion, many are the hardships, as in every battle. Thinking scorn of every pain, and vanishing such foes as hatred, these are exploits of victorious warriors. So again, this idea of the Bodhisattva as a hero. Suffering also has its worth, he says. Through sorrow, pride is driven out, and pity felt for those who wander in samsara. Evil is avoided, goodness seems delightful. I think this is actually a common thing that people in the caring professions notice, that when somebody is suffering, if they've been badly injured, if they've got cancer, they're often quite humble. Their sort of pride is sort of diminished, right? It's a sort of, you realize that you're not the sort of wonderful, paragon of health that you thought you were. and you begin to see that your own body has its own weaknesses. And because you see that, you gain a certain sympathy for other people who are in that predicament. And so actually one of the ways of developing compassion is actually coming to terms with your own suffering. You see your own suffering, and this shows a value in the suffering because it makes you sensitive to the sufferings of others. And then he says, suffering has its worth. Through sorrow, pride is driven out, and pity felt for those who wander in samsara. Evil is avoided, even goodness seems delightful. When one experiences suffering, you become more modest about yourself, you gain a certain empathy towards others, and then remembering the teachings, you realize that this suffering has come about through previous evil actions of your own. And so for that reason, you avoid doing it again in order to avoid this unpleasant consequence. And even virtue seems delightful. You gain a certain interest in positive behavior. So, I'm sorry, I've talked too much and we're right at the end of our time. But what I would like to point out in brief is that in this chapter, Shantideva uses all sorts of arguments to undermine this feeling of aggression and anger and angry retaliation. And he does this by encouraging us to sort of look at what we think of as an enemy and appreciate that the enemy is not really an enemy. To appreciate, for instance, that the person who is attacking us is himself the victim of his own defilement, that it's the defilement that is the enemy, not the aggressor. When you see this, you begin to see that that person is not the enemy that you originally thought. And that lightens up the situation very considerably. And then he says that, they're not responsible for what they're doing to me. It's their negativities that's causing them. And therefore he uses this image of the stick. He says that if someone hits you with a stick, you're not angry with the stick, even though it's a stick that's actually caused you pain. What you're angry with is the person who's holding the stick. But that person is actually in the grip of something else, namely that his or her negative emotions. So in a way, it's as absurd to be angry with the person in the grip of his emotions as it is to be angry with the stick that's in the grip of the aggressor. So, and then he says that, again, why is it that this person is injuring me? It's because of karma that I have myself accumulated. And so, as the Lojong teachings say so often, that when somebody attacks you, it's like an echo coming back to you from a cliff. When the echo comes back to you, it's because you've originally shouted. So when somebody attacks you, you have to remember that even if, it wasn't recently, maybe many lives before, it's come about because something I did. And then he goes on to say, you ought to remember that when you become a bodhisattva, he says this earlier on, I didn't read it out, I think, that anybody who attacks a bodhisattva, who injures a bodhisattva, because of the merit of that bodhisattva, because of what that bodhisattva is intending to do, that action, it becomes even more negative. To attack a bodhisattva is not like attacking an ordinary person. It's much worse. And so he says, we have become bodhisattvas we've started on the bodhisattva path. We ourselves have become perilous objects. The word in Tibetan is nyampo. And a perilous object is something that, in relation to which anything positive that's done in relation to that object is greatly increased. And anything negative that is done towards that object is greatly increased. So if you attack a lama, for instance, or a realized master, the consequences will be far greater than if you were to attack an ordinary person. And so Shantideva says, since we have become bodhisattvas, we've made ourselves extremely dangerous for other beings. So if we do things that provoke the anger of those beings, we are doing them a very great disservice. So in a situation where somebody attacks us, if we retaliate and make the situation worse, we're making it far more worse for them than it is for us. And so he says, he says, they are tormenting me, but in the end, I am the one who's tormenting them, because it's thanks to me. Because in this situation, if I practice patience, I will gain great benefit. But if I respond and provoke further aggression, I am causing them to accumulate much more negativity. So I am their tormentor. It's not they that are tormenting me. So for the Bodhisattva, in that kind of situation, it's essential to diffuse the conflictual situation. And then when he reflects upon the positive qualities of beings, he says that even enemies and friends are always kind. Beings are always kind to us. No matter, even if friends are obviously kind to us, but even enemies are kind to us, because they give us the opportunity to practice patience, to understand patience. So for the person who is training on this path, enemies are extremely valuable. So when somebody is attacking us, we shouldn't sort of immediately respond with anger and try to beat them down. We should instead recognize that they are giving us a precious opportunity to develop our patience. So he says that, in general, bodhisattvas spend their whole time doing good to beings, so they don't have many enemies. So when an enemy shows up, it's a really special occasion, this is a really good situation. This is, you've heard the Dalai Lama talk about the Chinese, that, they have been a precious opportunity for many Tibetans to learn, to progress upon the path. And it seems a bit far-fetched, but when you look at it in the way that Shantideva explains it, you can see that you can see the point. And he also says that the enemy is actually your teacher, because if you are practicing, if you consider yourself a Buddhist, if you consider yourself a practitioner of Mahayana, when somebody comes along, you may well have a feeling that you're not doing too badly. But then somebody says something, and you immediately react with anger, or not. And so what the enemy has done is actually shown you where you are on the path. So if you sort of watch your reactions to the way people treat you, it'll give you a good idea of how much more work you have to do, which is useful. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
This question is about, I think it was about this morning, and it has to do with exertion. Am I speaking? Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it had to do with sleep. And you were saying that the urge to sleep is a very negative thing, or wanting to sleep is very bad. And I've struggled with this for probably, like everybody has, for most of my life. It seems to me that in American culture, now I don't know, I did live in England for a while, but I only noticed this in American culture. Like school kids in high school, they have to get up like at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and it seems like sleep is a real problem in American culture. It's considered very negative, and there have been recent things like, you might know about Ariana Huffington and other authors who are saying sleep is good and it's underrated in our culture. And I wonder if you could speak to that. This is something that it's a major issue for me in my practice, and so
Yeah, I
on.
know what you mean.
And in fact, I don't even try to practice. I'm retired now, so when I'm sleepy, I don't try to practice. I'll take a nap and then I'll try to practice.
Yeah, well, I think that's the wise course. I mean, it's true that the Tibetans have a thing about sleep. They say that if you live to nearly 100, you've spent, I don't know how many years asleep,
35 years.
Yeah, 35 years. So and when you're asleep, you're in a state of complete mental wandering.
Complete
Mental wandering. So they try to sort of curtail sleep as much as possible.
So like in the 3-year retreat, that was a big issue.
Yeah,
right?
but on the other hand, you have to be sensible. It's a question of common sense. Everybody needs sleep. If you don't get enough sleep, it's dangerous. It's very bad for the health and so on. So I know that in some retreats, very strict retreats like the one that Sarah did, they slept in boxes. They slept sitting upright, which is what I don't know if you did in your retreat, Jeremy.
That'd be okay with me as long as I could sleep enough.
Yeah. Anyway, when we did retreat, our teacher said, no, it's no use. You'll never get. You won't be able, because Tibetans can sleep sitting up, right? You don't stay awake all night, but you sit on your cushion, right? But most of us can't. I can't sleep like that.
Yeah.
So he said it's far better to have a proper bed, to get 7 or 8 hours, and then, go to bed early, get up early, and then your mind is clear. Otherwise, you're wasting time. So, but on the other hand, he says laziness is a kind of attachment to sleep. He doesn't say laziness is sleep. He says, constantly wanting just to laze around and do nothing and, napping all the time, you won't get anywhere. So that's basically what he's saying. It's sort of, but for each individual, it's a question of common sense. Each individual has different needs, so, it's not a problem.
Can I ask one other question? What this is about is destroying, because we have the 4 karmas, and their destroying is it has a positive spin on it. So I'm wondering if you could just speak.
Sorry,
to
I
that.
didn't understand the 4.
The 4 karmas.
What do you mean?
The 4 karmas: pacifying, enriching, magnetizing, and destroying.
Okay.
Not
4,
in that
yes.
order.
Okay. Yeah. Mm.
And I'm wondering if you could just give a little context on. I know we talk about destroying as the negative aspect of anger, but could you give a broader context of the different flavors of destroying, so to speak?
Yeah. When you talk about the 4 activities, this is a tantric practice. This can be part of the sadhana, isn't it? And so, in that case, when you talk about wrathful suppression of the enemy, or whatever the negative emotion, it means it's not actually killing in the ordinary sense of the word. The whole idea of Vajra wrath is that you actually liberate the so-called
In a way, that's what when you're
nature.
talking about Shantideva, or Clark brought this up about Shantideva's very fierce opposition to the kleshas, in a way.
That's an interesting
Yeah.
point. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. I think that probably is true. That his sort of aggressive attitude towards his own negativity is a little bit the same. It's a way of liberating the obstacle,
Yeah.
right? So and he says quite specifically, this kind of aggression is a virtue, and for the sake of the result, you shouldn't spurn it. This kind of intolerance of your own weakness or your own negativity, and this willingness to do what you can to trample it down. So when you see that, the wrathful deities, that's what they're doing. They're trampling down the,
Right.
the kleshas.
Right.
So is that the context you wanted?
Yeah, basically, yeah. It just seemed like when you were talking about anger and destroying, it didn't sort of take that into account. So that's what I was wanting to get a context on that.
Yeah.
So that's fine. Thanks.
The only thing that I would add for the people who weren't there last night is the challenge of this patience chapter is when you're diffusing the situation, it often looks as though you're blaming the victim, namely oneself, because Shantideva has said, I'm a victim of this aggression because of what I've done. I'm calling them to me, and so on and so forth. So when that happens, you mustn't make the mistake of thinking that that's true as a general truth of all victims. Like the woman who's being raped is somehow responsible for what's happening to her. That's not what's being said at all. Or the child that's being abused. In a sense, of course, whatever happens to us is the fruit of karma. So to be murdered by somebody, to be tortured by somebody, to be raped by somebody, is an expression of karma from the past, maybe very far in the past. And so, but again, it's not a question of being punished for anything. This is the law of karma is just completely impersonal. It's as impersonal as the law of gravity, as we saw yesterday. And so the point is that if you want to protect yourself from these kinds of sufferings, any kinds of sufferings, you have to remove the causes of them. And these are negative activities. So, of course, in any given situation, given the fact that a karmic situation of a person is immensely complicated, there are all sorts of forces coming into play, and there's no point in sort of worrying about it or thinking that you yourself are to blame. The only idea that Shantideva is taking out of it is that karma and the fruits of karma are very real, that we must take seriously. So, we don't want to be in samsara, we don't want to continue in samsara. We have to cut the root of samsara and put an end to the causes of it. Because when people read this chapter, they think, Shantideva is being a sort of masochist, or he's sort of, saying things that are really not helpful in life. But I think you have to see it in context and seeing exactly what it means, in that kind of reasoning.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
And so when he says, when you look at beings and you see anybody, he says you should try to, even unpleasant beings, even aggressive beings, you should try to remember that our enlightenment comes about through two factors. It comes about through the teachings of the Buddha, and it comes about through the merits that we accumulate in our interaction with beings. So the Buddha and the beings are equally important. He says, what kind of spiritual tradition is it that just gives reverence to the Buddhas and not to beings? He says, when you see beings, you should remember that it is through them that you will come to accomplishment, that you will come to freedom and enlightenment. These are your precious aids. And so he says that, they are our protectors, and therefore we should not think that we can do what we like to beings, but at the same time be reverencing Buddhas, because they are exactly equal. They're not equal in the benefits they give us, but they are equal in the sense that they are both indispensable to the practitioner of the path. And that's why he says, should you, and one gradually does, through the practice of the mind training, you find that beings you start to become a little bit more sensitive, even towards beings that you don't know, as we said last night. That's something that's also worth remembering when, trying to cultivate patience. So, I'm sure there's a lot more to be said, but time is up. So, I think tomorrow we go on to stage 3. So thank you very much for patiently listening. I know it wasn't very riveting, but as I said, this is a workshop. It's not it's not an entertainment.
Thanks very much.